Hi everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to say something about the book. I always wanted to write a story about LGBT experiences in the Arab world. A part of me was scared to write something like this because of just the stigma around. But at some point I realized that I had to write the story inside of me. 2011, when the Arab revolutions happened, there was a connection between the revolutions and a lot of the problems and the questions that I had about sexuality and about my personal issues. And so I began to write. And it became very much a way to reflect on the Arab revolutions that were happening and how the situation changed in 2012 and 2013 and 2014. And the book started changing as well. And it started to make a lot more sense. I felt like I had reached this interesting relationship with history as it was happening. But I think also the book was personal to me because it reflected a lot of my experiences living and studying in Canada during September 11th, and how that also made me realize my own identity as an Arab person. I don't think it's accurate to say that it's an autobiographical novel because a lot of the things that are in the book didn't happen to me, but I feel like the emotions in the book are very autobiographical. I think one of the things that is maybe autobiographical is the question of identity, and that's something that comes up in the novel a lot. The writing came from a place of questioning. I didn't have the answers. I was just trying to solve the answers in my head as I was writing. And I think that's why Rasa himself is also negotiating and having to navigate these different identities. The identity of finding his sexuality being the most important identity in some circles of his life, and then in other circles of his life or in other places in the world. For example, when he goes to America, he suddenly discovers this new Arab identity, which he didn't realize he had. And I remember reading two thinkers really on the question of identity while I was at university that really helped me understand the questions that I had and some of the troubles that I was going through. And the first was Ma'louf, and Rasa talks about Ma'louf in the novel. And Ma'louf talks about how every single person around the world has a number of different identities, right? And this is not just political or religious or racial. It's also identities like son, father, brother. And we identify with the aspect of our identity that is under attack in different places. And so that's why I suddenly realized why I never really felt Arab until I went to Canada, and then September 11th happened. And suddenly I felt that this Arab identity was under attack, and I suddenly felt myself to be very Arab more than anything else. And so I felt that this was an important issue to talk about in the novel, and I think it's a very complicated issue and there is no resolution. And I don't actually think there is a resolution to these questions. I think that you see a lot in a lot of political movements now in the 21st century, this desire to essentialize and to simplify identities. And my reaction to that is to actually do the opposite. I think trying to simplify to a single identity is completely unrealistic, and I think it's just driven by fear. And I think as well, although it's hard, we as humans need to try and lean and accept the complexity of our identities and accept that sometimes there are contradictions within ourselves and there are answers that we might not necessarily come to us very easily. So I think that aspect of the story and the fact that the story ends with this idea of there's no clear resolution to all of these questions, I think that's also important. I felt it was important for the reader to leave the book recognizing that there is no easy answer, there is no clear right and wrong, and that's okay. And it's okay to live in the complexity and just, go have a beer in Guapa, which is what they do in the end. I think one thing that interests me in writing more generally, but I think with this book I really looked at, was the interplay between the private and the public. And I think for example, in a lot of Arab societies, there's a very big, clear differentiation between how you live your life privately and how you live publicly. And the private domain is seen very much as something that is not touched upon, whereas the public and how you act in public is a very different thing. And for me, Rasa is someone who finds himself unable to navigate this duality between the private and public and struggles a lot with accepting this. And when I was growing up in the Middle East, I really felt that it was just me who had this difficulty of public and private. And it's very interesting after the book came out. And even when I was writing the book, I thought, no one has this trouble. It's just me who has this problem. I'm the strange person. And so it's been very nice to hear from a lot of people who connected with that aspect of the book, not just in the Middle East, but around the world, the struggle between the private and the public. And linked to that as well, I think there's also an issue of the personal and the political. At what point does the personal become political? And how do political events impact personal lives? That's something that Rasa questions a lot in terms of his involvement in the protest, but also his relationship with his very conservative conservative, very traditional grandmother. I was interested in looking at how political dysfunctions and political structures, whether it's dictatorships or Islamist organizations, or even like this idea of chaos, how they echo and have a pattern with personal and familial dynamics and relationships. I was very close to my grandmother growing up. The grandmother in the book is based on my grandmother. I love her a lot, but even to this day, she's a huge dictator. I found my relationship with my grandmother to very much echo my relationship to the protests and the revolutions that were happening. And I felt that I was working with an NGO and with youth activists and women activists in the revolution. And I found myself getting very frustrated because I felt like a lot of journalists from outside and a lot of cultural thinkers and writers who were writing about the Middle East from outside were not looking at the personal elements of these things. They were only looking at the political elements. And things were a lot more complicated. People would talk about, how can people support Bashar al-Assad? It doesn't make sense. It's crazy. But in my mind, I could understand why someone could. I could see how my relationship with my father and my relationship with my grandmother could justify these things, that there is this personal element to political revolutions and political processes that we need to look at. And so for me, writing the book, I felt like you cannot write about the political without writing about the personal. I'm still trying to figure out what this novel is about. I started from a position of wanting to write about the Iraqi side of my family. They engaged with art and with the history of Iraq over the past century, so I was interested in looking at that. But then as I began to write, I realized that I was writing about something else. I was writing about this family, but I was writing about memory and exile and mental illness and creativity and trauma, and how these things are all interlinked. And I think it is being driven partly by my own experience of trauma and mental illness, my experience not just as someone who was a refugee as a child, but also as someone who was involved in these revolutions that failed. And I think there's a lot of depression and anxiety and trauma because of what happened the last 7 years for a lot of people who are my age. There's no spaces for us to process these emotions. Something very monumental happened, and then there was a very big failure of hope. And I think people are really suffering, even not just the physical suffering, but just the mental suffering of having something like this fall apart. And so I find myself writing about these issues, and I'm thinking about Iraq when I'm doing that. So I'm kind of interested in Iraq, and I'm thinking about all of these other things. And I'm thinking about the body as well, and the link with the body and the land. So I have all of these ideas in my head. Some days I feel like, oh, this is great, I'm going to finish the book by the end of the year. And then other days I'm just thinking I should just throw it all in the trash can. So it depends. Some days are good, some days are not good, but that's writing. And it's a very difficult context at the moment. It feels very bleak and very hopeless. I think writing is a way of having hope in the world.